Alright, so this is the third and final part of week 1 lecture videos on Reconstruction. This one's going to be pretty short. I try not to have them go too long, which is why I broke this into 3 parts. Honestly, it probably could have been 2 parts, but here we are. So I'm going to talk about the end of Reconstruction and sort of what was going on in the South as we get further into the 1870s, and sort of some questions we're going to be having when we go into week 2. Okay. So in 1876 there was a presidential election. That tends to happen every 4 years or so. Don't know if you know, but it was Tilden versus Hayes. Okay. It was an incredibly close vote with accusations of election illegalities in Florida. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. Those of you who are familiar with the 2000 election of Bush versus Gore, it's very similar kind of circumstances. So the election goes to Congress and a compromise is made. Tilden, the Democrat, concedes to Hayes, the Republican, in exchange for the end of federal occupation in the South. Federal troops leave the South for good in 1877. Their departure ends protection for African Americans and ends a remarkable period of political experimentation and compromise from the end of the Civil War. By 1877, the South had been taken back by the Democrats, self-proclaimed redeemers, Southerners who came to power in the waning years of Reconstruction, claimed that they had redeemed the South from the Republican interference of Reconstruction. Redeemers would now spend the majority of their time attempting to undo post-war changes in the South. Now, there are variations in the conditions of African Americans at the end of Reconstruction, and variations in civil liberties are going to depend on where people live. In places where blacks are only 30% of the population, like the upper South states, North Carolina, Virginia, they receive some civil rights because there are not enough of them to carry any election or elect any African American officials. Instead, whites can manipulate them using legal means. Okay. One of those means is sharecropping. So sharecroppers farmed small plots of land all year and divided the crop equally with the white landowner at the end of that year. Sharecroppers often were lent their farming equipment on credit from the white landowner, and this often led to an inescapable cycle of debt. However, it was attractive to freed people because they could build their own homes on the plantation land and were paid in a share of the crop, which came with certain economic freedom. Landowners benefited from the sharecropping system by not having to pay wages to most sharecroppers, right, because they're paid in the share of the crop, and by gaining labor that had been lost with the end of slavery. Sharecropping contracts were required, but white planters could often include unfair clauses due to the overall lack of literacy among newly freed slaves. So in the Deep South, where there are large numbers of African Americans, whites strip them of their civil rights and ability to vote. As a result, while slavery is destroyed by the Civil War, equality is not achieved. With the rise of segregation and American apartheid, in which black people are legally inferior to whites, is established in the South, which leaves the South with a bit of a paradox. Poor whites allied with rich whites against blacks. So why do whites unite, even against their own interests, against black people? Why does race trump class through most of American history? These are questions that we'll return to in the next few weeks. I'm going to briefly mention the tragedy of the post-war South. So poor black and poor white sharecroppers now live in a land once home to some of the world's greatest export economies and to the highest rate of farm ownership in America. Sharecropping is part of a set of arrangements that arrested freedom for most African Americans for a century. Sharecropping seems to have greatly reduced the freedom of former slaves and poor Southern whites to make their own choices. But sharecropping, as mentioned before, might have held certain attractions for such people. The bottom line on sharecropping is that sharecropping was a compromise. It was not slavery, but it was not freedom either. So, despite its limitations, Reconstruction marked a radical departure in American and world history. One of two of the nations that abolished slavery in the 19th century, the other was Great Britain in 1838. The United States, within a few years of emancipation, clothed its former slaves with citizenship rights equal to those of whites. Reconstruction also revealed some of the tensions inherent in 19th century discussions of freedom. The policy of granting black men the vote while denying them the benefits of land ownership strengthened the idea that free citizens could be poor, dependent laborers. Reconstruction placed on the national agenda a problem that would dominate political discussion for the next half century. How, in a modern society, to define the economic essence of freedom. Reconstruction also teaches us valuable lessons in the uses of history. We think about how we remember Reconstruction. Reconstruction was an extension of federal powers and big government through the protection of Southerners, Southern black people specifically, with the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, federal occupation by troops. During the years of Reconstruction and some of the years after, in many places, there are black people who hold office. There are black people who are voting. So these are important things to think about. So what would the New South look like? That's a discussion that we'll have to save for next time. For this week when we meet together, we will focus on the documents we read this week and talk about how we interpret historical evidence. So, for our meeting, please, after you've watched all of these, or before, you can read the textbook, Give Me Liberty, and the documents, Voices of Freedom, for this week. Please take the online attendance quiz. All of that needs to be done before we meet in person on Wednesday. Okay? All right. I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit about Reconstruction. I welcome any questions you have about the lectures. You can either email me or you can ask me in class. I'll see you guys for our first meeting pretty soon. Woo woo!